So, Layla,
Yeah.
do you want to start?
Yes, hello everyone. Welcome to this webinar discussion about feminist leadership during COVID-19. I'm so delighted to see so many of you here at this event. I'm Layla Billing, and together with my colleague Natalie Brooke, I'm going to be co-moderating this discussion. Natalie and I convene a small group of senior women working in the women and girls sector who connect regularly to discuss and learn more about feminist leadership. We're part of an informal collective called the Transformative Feminist Leadership Group. And before we kick off, just some housekeeping. Please use the chat box and not the Q&A box during the course of this webinar if you want to share some thoughts and ideas. We'll do our best to moderate the chat box, but because we've got hundreds of participants joining us today, we might not be able to get to everyone's questions or comments, so please forgive us for that. I want to say a massive special welcome to all our French-speaking participants, many of whom are joining us from West Africa, from Central Africa, from Madagascar and Morocco. Welcome to all of you, bienvenue. Please use the interpretation function by clicking on the interpretation button at the bottom of your Zoom screen and selecting French. And also another note to say we're going to be recording this discussion, and if you're tweeting, you can use the hashtag feminist leadership. Let me just introduce you though to a woman without whom this wouldn't be happening. We've got a fantastic interpreter today, Merald Kui, who's based in Ghana, and she's going to be supporting us today. You can see her on the video screen. Hi, Merald, thank you so much. So let's begin. So since COVID-19 started, I think we've been surrounded by many different examples of leadership. We've seen strong men leaders. I'm looking at you, Bolsonaro, Trump and Johnson, promising certainty in the most uncertain of times. They either present the coronavirus as the enemy and suggest they're the only ones who can defeat it, or they downplay the significance of the virus in the first place, dismissing it as a little bit of the flu or a cold. And if we take the case of Bolsonaro in Brazil, he was attending anti-lockdown protests at a time when the Amazon's biggest city, Manaus, was being forced to dig trenches to accommodate the dead. Now, in contrast, we've also seen some leaders, many, but not all of them women, take a very different approach. Leaders like Taiwan Tsai Ing-wen and Silveria Jacobs, who's the premier of the tourism-dependent small Caribbean island of St. Martin's, they didn't underestimate the risks. They focused on preventative measures and they prioritized long-term social well-being over short-term economic considerations. If you don't know these women, I highly suggest you look them up. And meanwhile, while we're talking about leadership, it's also really important that we pivot to those leaders who are working at the local level. I mean, arguably, no one was more prepared for this virus than those women's rights organizations that have been dealing with persistent crises such as HIV and AIDS, who've been dealing with protracted conflicts and things like Ebola for many years. And that's also not to mention those organizations who have been dealing with the so-called shadow epidemic of gender-based violence, which has intensified during this period. These organizations have all been really well prepared for the gendered impacts of COVID-19 in a way that few others have. So within this kind of kaleidoscope of differing models of leadership, we're here to talk about a very specific approach that some leaders are using to navigate COVID-19. We're here to discuss how feminist leaders are applying their feminist values during this time. And luckily we have an amazing panel here with us to share their experiences. So first I want to welcome Jean Kemitare. Welcome, Jean. Jean is a Ugandan feminist currently working as the Programs Director at Urgent Action Fund Africa. She's responsible for strategic leadership and program implementation. Previously, she worked as program manager for the Gender-Based Violence Prevention Network at Raising Voices. She's worked in the gender equality and violence against women and girls space for over 10 years. Surina Khan, welcome Surina, is CEO of the Women's Foundation of California, where she leads the foundation's work to advance gender, racial, and economic justice. The foundation's program strategy is focused on building community-based power through investing in non-profit organizations, training community leaders in policy advocacy, and mobilizing significant financial resources. Some of her previous board service has included funders for LGBTQ issues, Alliance for Justice, and the Astrea Lesbian Foundation for Justice. Now to Lee Webster. Welcome, Lee. Lee is Deputy Director of International Development at ActionAid UK. She's the co-chair of the Board of Trustees of the UK's Gender and Development Network. She's got extensive experience of women's rights and working with women's movements across policy, programs, research, communications, and funding. She currently leads ActionAid UK's international development portfolio. And outside of work, she gives most of her energy to raising her son to share her feminist values. And last but certainly not least, Vivienne Hayes. Welcome, Vivienne. Vivienne is the Chief Executive of the Women's Resource Centre in the UK. With over 30 years in the women's sector, both delivering services and leading organisations, Vivienne's passion is working towards substantive equality for all women. She has been key to the UK government's examination of CEDAW at the UN on their progress in achieving all women's rights. Vivienne was awarded the National Diversity Award in 2013 for Gender Role Model, and she continues to advocate for more women leaders across all disciplines and sectors, and she gives much of her free time to mentoring other women. So welcome to our wonderful panel, and welcome to all of you. Enough from me. Let's get started with some questions. And my first one really is, it's a good entry point. I mean, feminist leadership means very different things to different people. We often see it equated rather simplistically with being just about having more women in leadership positions. So very simply, I want to ask the panel how they define it. And at the same time, I'd like to ask the audience, please feel free to use the chat box to share what you think feminist leadership means to you. And you can share in French or English, whatever you're most comfortable with. But first of all, let's start with Jean. Jean, feminist leadership, what does it mean to you?
Yeah, in this era of COVID-19, feminist leadership to me is a prerequisite to a new world. We keep talking about the new norms brought about by Corona. Really, feminist leadership is a prerequisite to a new world. We are experiencing the impacts we have of COVID-19 because we do not have enough feminist leadership going around the world. Feminist leadership really is based on a consciousness of power. Who has it, who doesn't have it, and how me who has mine, I'm using it to foster leadership, inspire change, inspire, positive transformation. Of course, feminist leadership is about positive transformation because it is based and rooted in an understanding of power and oppressive systems that foster structural injustice and inequality. It then engages with all types and expressions of power at different levels, at the self, at community, at organization, and at national level. It recognizes that the what, so the work that we are doing, is as important as the how. And that goes back to the analysis of power. Who has it, who doesn't, and what are the experiences they have as a result of having different types of power or different experiences. So feminist leadership is engaged with bringing in, realizing the difference and strengths in diversity and dealing with that diversity in whichever forms that it manifests, whichever hierarchies of privilege and power that different people access or do not access, feminist leadership intersects with that. It is involved with, because it's looking at different types of power and who accesses it, therefore it is involved with intersectionality and intersectional analysis of experiences of different people and how to address that. And I'm not just talking of community going out to the community, even in the organization. It's mutual, it's collaborative, it involves co-creation, it's effective, it's transformational, it supports thriving of all human beings to live to their fullest potential. Not only that, it also has a keen sense of importance of balancing work, use of power with well-being of the body, mind, and soul. So that is feminist leadership to me. And we do not have enough of it, I'm sorry. I really wish it could go around the whole world. Half of the conflict or more than half of the conflict we have would not exist. Challenges we're having with pandemics would not exist. Gendered impacts of anything, not only the pandemic in the world, would not exist. The world and the way we are stewarding the natural resources of the world would be different. So that's, to me, how I interpret feminist leadership.
Thanks, Jean. A really powerful call to action for more feminist leadership. Yeah, I loved what you said about thriving, supports thriving. Surina, what about you? Would you agree with Jean on some of that analysis?
100% of that analysis. I completely agree with you, Jean, and I thank you for giving us such a powerful definition. I would just add, for us, for me, and also our organizing principle at the Women's Foundation of California is very much what Jean described in terms of building community power, having a transformational vision, and doing it through a framework of kind of abundance and promoting wellness and freedom ultimately. And so for us, that has really meant centering people. We believe that people who are closest to the problems in their communities are also closest to the solutions. And that is, also part of feminist leadership. So I just thank you, Jean, for that very thoughtful and complete definition.
Yeah, and that idea of abundance of power, I think, is a really important one, because so often our organizations kind of operate with this ideology of this scarcity of power, right? There's only so much power to go around, and let's concentrate it at the top. And I guess what feminist leadership does is offer us a completely different perspective around power and its distribution. Thanks, Surina. Let's go to Lee. Lee, how do you define it?
Hi, I wanted to say a couple of things about what I think it isn't, perhaps. So I think it's important to say that feminist leadership isn't a tick box exercise. It's not the latest trend or something to do in 2020 in the strange year that we find ourselves in. It's certainly not just another management tool or framework, and it's actually not an end in itself. So at ActionAid, we have global leadership principles, and the definition from that I find really helpful is the positive and inclusive use of power to build an organization capable of changing the world. And that really says a lot to me, and it recognizes the understanding of power within that. And I think for me personally, feminist leadership is about everything we bring as feminists, our journey of feminism, to bring everything we know about power, about gender, and about intersecting inequalities, our feminist lens on the world, bringing all that to how we lead in our work. So it's essentially about love. It's about bringing our love for women and girls, our hope, our vision for a better world, and being really courageous about how we then make decisions, prioritize our work, and lead in our areas.
Thank you, Lee. Viv.
Hi.
Yeah.
Good afternoon, everyone. Well, it's very difficult to add to all those things that have been said, which I completely agree with. I think along with that, if you want to call yourself a feminist leader, then you need humility. And as Lee said, start from a place of what has been called revolutionary love. And being open to challenge and criticism yourself and to reflect and grow. I think feminist leadership is a challenge in itself because it means doing things differently. and it means working in ways that challenge the mainstream leadership model, which is rooted in extraction and oppression. And so our job is to disrupt those frameworks of oppression, which are upheld by, for example, patriarchy and white supremacy. We still don't really have a blueprint for transformational change of society, which for me is what feminism's about, because I think a blueprint that achieves all women's human rights will achieve everybody's human rights. If we could crack that, we'd solve all the problems of the world. I think also, I think it was Jean that said it, it's about supporting and sharing and giving away power, not holding on to it, because traditional notions of leadership are very linear, and what I hope we're trying to create is more of a web of leadership that all women and girls have access to joining. Because let's face it, we're not going to change the world with a handful of women. We need millions of women to do this. So we need to share what we know, learn from each other, and actually give away some of the power that we might have as individual women. And one of the things that we do at WRC is our feminist leadership training, which is about supporting and empowering women to recognise that they do already have some of those skills. They just need the opportunity and the support and the sisterly building of networks.
Thank you, Viv. Yeah, some great, really, really great points there. Natalie, what's coming out of the chat box?
Thanks, Layla. Yeah, lots of comments here. I'm just going to pick out a few to share with you all. Just to say, if you're making a comment in the chat box and you want to share it with all participants as well as panelists, there's a little blue box you can click on in the chat box, and it allows you to either choose to send your message to all panelists or all panelists and attendees. And if you're happy to share it widely, then please click all panelists and attendees. So Caroline said, feminist leadership listens and does not generalise and silence those in the margins. It recognises that the leader does not have to know everything and that leaders are vulnerable too. It recognises that others can also lead and allows them to do this with support. Thank you, Caroline. We had lots of people agreeing with things that you were saying on the panel. Gertrude said, I think on a day-to-day basis, feminist ways of working is one in which it's collaborative, it's more comfortable, it's less hierarchical, more common sense, and both men and women need a feminist analysis of their leadership. We had a comment around the sharing of power. So feminist leadership making more power to go around rather than thinking power means taking power away from other people. Lots of stuff about scarcity and having a mind shift around that. And then Luendo commented that feminist leadership is acknowledging the power that one has and ensuring that it's used in a manner beneficial to us all. For me, it means unlearning a lot that society has defined and unpacking a lot around patriarchy and bias, which I completely agree with. Thank you all so much for sharing your comments.
Yeah, thanks everyone. I mean, I guess the golden thread running through all that is, underpinning all of that is the need, you know, as feminist leaders, we really must function with a very strong consciousness, not only of our own power, but also how we hold that power, how we exercise it, and how we change its distribution. Okay, great, thank you so much. Let's discuss something else. When COVID-19 hit us, many leaders weren't only thinking about the impact on their work or their programs or their grantees, but they were also really having to think about the impact on their staff and their teams. And I'm wondering how the panel went about promoting cultures of self and mutual care for their teams and their organisations during COVID-19. And I think, you know, for us, certainly for Natalie and I, a really core part of feminist leadership is about, you know, it's exactly that. It's promoting these cultures of mutual care and recognizing, I suppose, that particularly for minoritized groups, claiming the right to care and pleasure is a really deeply political act. You know, it's because it's about taking or claiming what other people are freely given. And I guess I want to start with Surina here, who incidentally wrote a really great blog on this topic recently, and it's on medium.com, so you should definitely check it out. Surina, do you want to respond to that? How did you support your staff and your team through this period? How have you been doing that?
Yeah, well, you know, I went really immediately to the feminist principles and values that I carry with me, and it allowed me and us as an organization to put those into practice in very tangible ways. So, and it started with the principles of what we've been discussing about compassion, care, the safety of the team and of our partners. And so we were early in the context of the United States and California to begin working from home before even we were asked to do so by local and state government. Of course, we have no national leadership here, so that there's no coordinated response. But we did our best, and the first thing we did was, as a matter of fact, I sent the email on March 8th, which is International Women's Day, to say that we should all begin working from home. And so the very first thing we did, we had just happened to have our monthly staff meeting scheduled for the following week. So we talked as a team, and we're a team of 19 people, about how we wanted to work together, given that we were working in new ways. And what I said is, it's no longer business as usual. So let's talk about how we do business as unusual. And we really put everything out on the table to say, rather than a monthly staff meeting, we want to check in with each other weekly. We want to make sure that, you know, we're understanding the different kinds of skills that people have and can bring. And if we're going to work in a virtual environment, there's people who know how to use Zoom or Slack, which we use very much. We realized, we asked ourselves questions about how are we caring for ourselves and our communities? And so we learned that many of us are cooks, and some of us are becoming gardeners. And so we brought that kind of into our daily life through our communications. We were much more intentional about communicating with each other and how we did that. But very tangibly, in addition to that, we also you know, looked immediately at our benefits and practices as an organization. And so we lifted all caps on sick time and vacation accrual, because we wanted staff to know that if they did get sick, they could take all the time they needed to get well. And while we encouraged people to take time off, we recognized that some of us can't actually go anywhere for a holiday or vacation, so we lifted those accruals. We very quickly went to a 4-day work week because we saw that, you know, our staff were having to not only do childcare, but also now became, you know, the cooks, the cleaners, the teachers in their households. And so we decided that if we just all tried to take Friday off, it wasn't a way of disconnecting necessarily. People said, how can you disconnect on Friday? And I said, well, I'm not disconnected. But we sort of all quiet down, because I said, you know, we create work for each other. So if we're all off on Fridays, it gives us time to be with our families and communities, but also to mentally process that we're going through a fundamental shift and reset in terms of the world. We increased our technology benefits, understanding that it might cost folks more to work from home in the sense of increased utilities and that kind of thing. And then we increased wellness benefits, but we basically looked at ways to reduce barriers. And so instead of opting into a fitness reimbursement, we said it's an opt-out, that it'll automatically show up in your paycheck, and you can use these benefits for any kind of mental wellness or, you know, online yoga classes, whatever it is that people needed. And then we sort of operated with an principle of inclusion. So the board wanted to know how is the staff doing, and the staff wanted to know how is the board being kept informed. So in the spirit of business as unusual, we opened up our monthly board executive committee meetings to the full staff and the board. And I have to say that was really an amazing experience in terms of just deepening our relationships with each other, which ultimately this is what gets the work done, is the relationships that we have. And all of that was happening in that very first week of, March 9th. And then, ultimately this is all for the work that we do, which is about building community-based grassroots power in our communities. And so our director of community investment that first week said, do we have resources to send funds to all of our partners, because they are going to have to adapt to working from home as well, and they may not have laptops and Zoom memberships. So we immediately wired $3,000 to all of our 25 core grant partners, and that led to what, we didn't require any application process. We just needed, if we didn't already have it, their banking information, so we could just wire the funds directly. And that led to what is now our Relief and Resilience Fund. And so when funders saw that we had the infrastructure, we developed a partnership with Blue Shield of California Foundation to fund every domestic violence shelter organization in the state of California. That's more than 130 organizations, because we saw that domestic violence rates were spiking in 40 to 80% in all of California's 58 counties. That then led to a partnership with the California Governor Newsom's office to create the first of its kind public-private partnership to really have a bold goal, speaking of the feminist principle of abundance, that we would raise $50 million to support our communities through this Relief and Resilience Fund, not just for the sort of very short-term needs in terms of people who are facing violence in their communities, but also to make sure that we are centering gender justice in California's recovery and restructure plan for the long term. So that's sort of just to give you a flavor of sort of starting with the internal to make sure that we're supporting our team so that we can be best equipped and develop the kind of culture of collaboration and that we all know that we're working towards the same goals. And I would just lastly say that there's a huge amount of gratitude on our team that we get to do this amazing work in terms of advancing racial, economic, and gender justice, and to do it with a team of such compassionate leaders, where a lot of these ideas are really generated by the team. And I saw themes of that coming up in the chat. So thank you for allowing me to just share a little bit about how we've approached it.
Thanks, Surina. You're getting a lot of love in the comments, so check that out. Yeah, lots of positive affirmations for your leadership. And I love what you're saying about, feminist leadership. That's not the end point, right? We do it in order to achieve something. We do it because it's going to accelerate our progress towards social justice. It's a means to an end, and a very important end at that. Lee, let's go to you on this issue
Sure.
of self and mutual care.
Yeah, sure. And great. It's very hard to follow that, Surina. That was really inspiring. Thank you. And I learned a lot from hearing from you. I thought I'd talk a little bit about how this worked within my team. So I run a fairly big team within a much bigger organization. And I think this has been a real testament to leadership of my colleagues and others in the team. And I guess the first most visible sign after lockdown of what our self-care might be was the acceleration of this principle of bringing our whole selves to work. And I guess for me, I strive myself to be myself and to bring myself to work as a whole person. And that means that I'm very honest about the challenges. And that's sometimes just practically that I have a 5-year-old child, and sometimes that parenting does directly rub up against what I'm able to do at work. And then, of course, like so many parents and around the world, as soon as we went into lockdown, things heated up in that area. But I found that by communicating through Teams and Zoom with colleagues, we quickly got to know each other in a really deeper way and really cared for each other through like the first really, really tough weeks when this was so new for everyone. People had sick relatives to care for. They had relatives very, very far away, often other parts of the world, that they weren't able to be with. There was suddenly homeschooling to be done, and many of us had to become teachers as well as workers, as well as cooks and cleaners. There were unruly housemates to contend with. And I find now, as the weeks wear on, and here certainly at ActionAid in the UK, we're looking to be working remotely for quite some time to come, possibly for the majority of the rest of the year. But I find that this sense of collective care has really grown, and that's really been led by others in the team who've really stepped up and called out the need for self-care. So we've had really regular check-ins, shared suggestions, encouraged each other to take longer breaks. We share our favourite music with each other. But I really do want to stress that this has been kind of leadership at all levels. And I think just a personal reflection is, I'm not always the best role model on self-care. I'm not always the person that is really good at putting boundaries, and I think I kind of overcommit. So what I've really appreciated from other leaders and people in my team is that I've been held accountable for that and been gently and lovingly pointed out that that's not the best leadership, that's not the best role modeling. If I as a leader am doing too much work, and then other people might feel that they might have to. So that's really my personal journey, but I think it's really been about that accountable collaboration and leadership from all parts of my team.
Thank you, Lee. I wish you were my boss. Viv, what about you? Self-care?
Yes, it's probably not my strongest point. I don't have many boundaries with how I work, but certainly my colleagues know that is not expected from them. I think, obviously, like everybody else, we moved to working from home. We did that a week before everybody else did in London, because I was so worried about everybody being on the tube. And our woman who organises us, she set up twice weekly staff meetings. One was a check-in meeting to see how people were doing. I think for me is showing my vulnerability allows my colleagues to do so. So, you know, one day I said, I'm having a really bad day today. This is not going well for me, or I feel overwhelmed. And that then gives permission for other women to really say how they're feeling, I think. Also, I said everyone could work shorter days, 5-hour days. I'm not sure they are doing, but they know they can, and they know they can take time out whenever they need to. The technology was all very new for us, but I think it's worked. But I do worry about the women's sector here in the UK who are our members, because I know that most of the women are actually working more hours than ever, and that is a great worry. So one of the things that we're offering is, self-care sessions that are part of our feminist leadership program, because it is very difficult for women to switch off. You know, if you've got children or people you're looking after, when do you fit the work in? So I think that's something that we have to keep an eye on, is how we look in after ourselves, and that it's okay to do that.
Thanks, Viv. Thank you. Jean.
Well, yeah, thank you everyone for sharing. I'm inspired. Some of the things are similar, of course, because we have similar politics. We identify as a feminist fund. So within our politics, we recognize, as Surina said earlier, that women and other structurally excluded groups are at the short end of self and collective care. They're expected to work and serve till they drop. And because we are socialized in that, as well as socialized in neoliberal capitalistic dispensations and understandings of work, we tend to work till we drop. And in a crisis like this, it's very easy for us to work till we drop. One of the principles at Urgent Action Fund Africa is we work with a soul. And this has been generated over years of learning and observing trends from the grant-making work, where we realized that without well-being, self-collective care, holistic security, the movement was at risk because we're having burnt out activists, women human rights defenders, unable to continue with pushing back against patriarchy. So that is an institutionalized practice, self and collective care. Internally, with the advent of the pandemic, we have some of us work virtually and some are based in the offices in Nairobi and in Zimbabwe. However, immediately to reduce the risk, we went also virtual. And so we had to support staff who are not working virtually with means to be able to remain working virtually, especially because we are in countries where there are power cuts and the internet is not that stable. So that had to be put into consideration. And then we had every bi-monthly group check-ins and also one-on-one check-ins, as well as check-ins with a psychosocial therapist. Similar to other colleagues here, we, in recognition of the additional work that we now have as caregivers in the home and beyond that, well, we've moved to a 4-week work day. We've added some 5 days to the annual leave dispensation. We have what we call flexi hours. So between you and your supervisor, I may have to do childcare early in the morning, get children ready, make breakfast and so on. So I'll start later on and end later on, and that provision is there. We reworked the program that we had to make it realistic. So some program activities that we planned to make it realistic. We also put in place, we have put in place measures to keep in touch because being virtual has its own challenges. So we are going to have what we're calling a virtual retreat. I will experiment with that to just take time off to think with each other online. So we'll see how that goes. But then also with our partners, grantees, because self and collective care is really important to us, we then put out calls for grants that can be accessed for healing and collective care within their organizations with communities of women. And that has been oversubscribed, if I may say so. We are also thinking of discussions around organization resilience and sustainability, because individuals, especially heads of organizations, are struggling with that issue, and that's bearing upon their well-being. I think we also have put out pieces on working virtually, because suddenly most of our partners are now working virtually, and that's not something they were prepared for or used to doing. And so we've provided resources based on our experiences, an article on working virtually. And I think
Great.
Really similar to what the rest of the colleagues have been doing. I like the bit on accountability because myself, I'm likely not that great at boundaries, not that great at self-care. So we hold each other accountable, and I've been good at holding colleagues accountable, but they've held me accountable to my own self-care practice, which adds to the whole collective care discourse and practice.
Yeah, absolutely. And some really practical ideas that everyone's been giving. I hope there's lots of questions and desire to learn more about how you did some of this stuff in the chat box. So yeah, I encourage the panelists to take a look. I'm going to move on because we could talk for hours on each of these topics, really. And I guess my next question is around doing this in reality. I mean, in many of us work in workspaces or organizations that are highly gendered. The institutions, many of our institutions are kind of beset by racial inequalities, by other forms of intersecting inequalities. And I sometimes think trying to be a feminist leader in these kind of spaces, you know, it's not for the faint-hearted, right? We don't practice leadership in a vacuum. We don't practice leadership in feminist utopias. You know, someone once said to me, someone I respect very much, said to me, you know, Layla, it's all very well speaking about your values all the time, but when you're a leader, you're going to need to stop being so idealistic. You know, you're going to have to get real, which, you know, to me was a really interesting point, because, you know, I often think idealism is presented as this kind of negative binary to Western rationalism and Western ideas of pragmatism, right? But anyway, regardless of that, you know, as leaders, we do have a host of barriers to contend with. And many of these are those challenges that are coming about as a result of COVID-19. So many organizations in the nonprofit sector are facing huge budget cuts. You know, people have multiple competing priorities. And I'm wondering, you know, what are some of the trade-offs you're having to make, or what are some of the difficult decisions that you're facing? And also, you know, when you're in these situations, how do you bring your feminist values and your principles to the way that you're trying to navigate your way through them? And Lee, I want to go to you on that, I think.
Sure. And Layla, I'd just say, please don't lose your idealism. I think we need leaders who keep the idealism and the optimism alive. So I guess from my perspective, and I sit in the UK international development sector, and I appreciate that's not everyone in the audience will be there, but for those of us who are, we've seen three really huge issues emerge in the last few months. I mean, first, what we're talking about primarily today is COVID. And then also came really much needed renewed focus on anti-racism and decolonisation of our sector following the resurgence of the Black Lives Matter movement. And then on top of that, a few weeks ago came the quite sudden announcement that the UK Department for International Development will be merged into the UK Foreign and Commonwealth Office. And all three of those have huge implications, both internally and externally, for every single one of us working in the UK international development sector, both in terms of internally, in terms of our ways of working, our programs, and also our external work and how we relate to the rest of the world. So yes, there's a lot of decisions being made at the moment, and some of those feel like they're going at great speed. And I think the important thing to remember is that feminist leadership is not fair weather. It's not just for the good times. It's not just a thing that we do when we're on top of all our other work. In fact, it's times like this when we really need to double down on it and really center feminism in our decision making and leadership. And I think it's fair that the questions from the audience around asking questions about practicalities, I think that's a really good challenge. So one of the practical ways that we do it, we actually have feminist leadership principles and feminist behaviours framework that I always have printed out near me to use to check in with myself. But it really highlights the principles of courage, of accountable collaboration, of sharing power and inclusion, inviting respectful feedback, and then really listening to that feedback. And I think those are some of the ways that then we all make better decisions and see some better outcomes. And I think one practical way for people who are leading, as in line managing, is to really get to know and understand the perspectives of our teams, of the people we work closely with. Because I'm afraid at times like this, there will be decisions that get made very quickly in very fast changing circumstances. So for me, as much as possible, I consult and I listen, and so I go to organisational discussions informed by what my team is asking me to take forward. And on those occasions where that's just not possible, I use my best knowledge of them all. I think about the conversations we've had, and some of those conversations are the ones, you know, informally. As I said, we're getting to know each other in deeper ways through lockdown. And then just be really accountable and say, I was in this situation, I had to contribute to a decision, this decision was made, and this is how I represented your views in that. And I think it really is a long journey, and I've been in my role a couple of years now, so I've really been able to prioritize getting to know the people I work with. But I'd say that's my practical tip, is is to really know and understand the varied perspectives of your teams.
Thanks, Lee. Jean, what about you? I mean, you're dealing with women human rights defenders. There's lots of challenges coming up. I mean, what are some of the trade-offs or concerns that you're facing at the moment?
Yeah, I agree with that comment here that feminist leadership is not for the faint-hearted. It's certainly not the easy route out. Actually, the other type of leadership is the easier one. We are all socialized in a patriarchal and capitalistic dispensation, so to work out of that norm is not necessarily the easiest. Now, come the pandemic, and for some of us that are funders, rapid response granters, our mandate is to fund strategic needs. So these are strategic opportunities to advance women's rights. That's our mandate as a feminist fund. Come the pandemic, women human rights defenders, the actual reality on ground, what is now strategic, is what is considered humanitarian aid, is what is considered practical needs. And that is not the money that we had, right? So speaking of trade-offs, how do you start and where do you start and what did we have to trade off? So we had to look at our mandate as we are giving politicized, ours is politicized philanthropy. We are close to the movements we serve. We work in solidarity and collaboration with them. And right now, relief items of a certain nature are actually strategic needs. Looking at the politics of survival, we had to make that decision. We had, luckily, some funders who were understanding and flexible, and we were able to do that. Unfortunately, there are also some where that dynamic is not an option. And so that becomes a challenge in the broader social justice, equality, unpacking oppressive systems, ecosystem. Because as a funder, a feminist funder, we are responsive to the needs of our movement. And right now, that's the apparent need. So that was a big challenge, a big trade-off. We made a strategic decision to do a hybrid of funding for both practical, what we are addressing as practical and strategic needs. And this is based on the fact that on our politics, and we are not apologetic around that, even if our written mandate is addressing strategic time-sensitive needs. Right now, we're terming it the politics of survival. There's no way people who are unable to access PPEs, to access an income, to access food, are able to then engage in those strategic activities. However, we are going for both because even as we address those immediate practical needs, there's the deeper systemic issues that we needed to address. So that's a trade-off, reducing some of the money that we had for strategic activities to go to addressing practical needs. That's at the strategic level. And then at the operational level, we've had to engage in what we are calling austerity measures. We've put a cap on recruitment. We had sadly to put a cap on things like staff capacity development just to save money as we anticipate for, for the future. So those have been difficult trade-offs. What happens when the money that's flexible runs out, and yet in Africa, the curve is not at a homogeneous level. Some countries are up there, others are still climbing. So the situation is still with us that we are dealing with. And so we are going to fall back to our principles, feminist principles, our principles of feminist philanthropy, and walk hand in hand in solidarity with the movements we serve. That might bring us certain interesting discussions with funders, but our role is really to politicize the philanthropic landscape. So those are the major trade-offs that I can pick. And again, I go back to the fact that feminist leadership is not for the faint-hearted, because some of those discussions have been difficult discussions.
Absolutely, yeah. Great. I'd love to ask all of you this question, but we're speeding through the time. And Natalie's got some really good questions for you. So Natalie, I'm going to hand over.
Thanks, Layla. And I'm aware there's a really lively and rich discussion happening in the chat box as well. So thank you all so much for your comments. And I can see people replying to each other. So please do continue to do that if we can't come to your question directly. So our next question really starts to address some of the increasing inequalities that we're seeing as part of COVID-19. So as feminist leaders, we're dealing with the fact that the crisis is laying bare a wide variety of intersectional inequalities, which are in fact more visible than before and intensifying. Relatedly, we've seen a particular spotlight on racial inequalities as a result of the emergence or re-emergence of the Black Lives Matter movement. So what is our role as feminist leaders to respond to these types of intersectional inequalities that COVID-19 and Black Lives Matter has laid bare? Viv, are you okay if I come to you first on that question?
Absolutely, thank you. I think we have to thank the Black Lives Matter movement for pushing open the doors of funders and some decision makers here in the UK. What's happening for Black people is nothing new. It's been going on for hundreds and hundreds of years, but unfortunately, the majority of white people, including women who call themselves feminists, have failed to acknowledge that. So I'm very optimistic that the fact that this has been thrust into our consciousness will actually improve the feminist movement, because the mainstream white feminist movement in our country is actually not doing a very good job. I see lots of things day in and day out across our sector that really deeply upset and offend me. And, you know, I'm being really honest here. I don't think there's any point in pretending if we don't speak our truths, then we're not going to move forward. And that is what our eye should be on, is moving forward together. But that means that we have to acknowledge the reality of racism and the reality of what we as white women hold on to is the privilege and the power. We have to start shutting up and listening better. And we have to be able to understand that being called out or criticised, you know, it's normal. Nobody knows everything. We have to be more open to hearing different things and being able to reflect and move forward. I think on the upside, what I see happening because of Black Lives Matter is that now we're more able to talk about, to funders and decision makers, structural inequality, whereas those words had become off the agenda, out of the dialogue. Now we're able to talk about it finally again and be heard. And so I'm doing some work in London with other equalities organisations, with groups of funders, because they've suddenly realised that they're not addressing structural inequality, and we are supporting them, and they're understanding that the way to actually make transformational change is to make grants to community, what we call led by and for organisations, because actually my personal view is that larger organisations cannot do the work, because they end up having to fundraise to feed the machinery they've created. Whereas community organisations, and we talk about women's led by and for, they are from the communities with whom they work. They know what the issues are, and they know what the solutions are. And so that potentially is a really positive outcome. But I just hope that as white women who call ourselves feminist, we actually are going to become feminists, because a feminism for one group of women is not feminism, and it will not achieve transformational change.
Thanks, Viv. That's a really clear message and a call to action, particularly for those of us who are white feminists, to consider our role. And I really agree about your point about structural inequality suddenly becoming part of our lexicon and our language, and something that perhaps we can use to our advantage in dealing with and influencing funders in particular. Surina, can I come to you on this? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think it's really important for us to, again, just come back to the principles of centering people who are experiencing problems to really develop solutions, and then adapt and question our practices so that we're supporting that framework. And so for us, that has meant, being a majority women of color led organization, and just in terms of what our organization looks like, our senior leadership team is 80% women of color, including brown and Black women. Similarly, our staff is almost 80%, I think, women of color, and our board has always been a majority women of color. In fact, they initiated that. That's been a good practice that the organization has had, but let's institutionalize it. So we actually changed our bylaws a couple of years ago to say that we want to be representative or reflective of California's population, and it allowed us to go even deeper than just thinking about race, but to also think about people with disabilities and immigration status, indigenous communities. And so I think that is really important to foreground. And for us, what it means then in terms of practices is that the status quo when you see a job description, for example, is BA required, graduate degree preferred for many of the organizations that we work in. And so when you talk about being community-based and centering the community, if we're trying to, upend the criminal justice system in the way that it works, or law enforcement in the way that it works, many of the, calls to action that we're hearing from the Movement for Black Lives, then, the person who might be best equipped in our organization, for example, to come up with a criminal justice grant-making strategy might be somebody who has experience being in the criminal justice system, and that probably has to do with issues of poverty, which means that they might not have been able to finish their BA degree. And so we did away with that language of BA required, graduate degree preferred. We really ask for experience. Similarly, we post salary ranges so that there's some level of transparency. And so I think that those contribute to the kinds of diversity and leadership that we're looking for. So we have to really think about our practices and how that can foster the kind of organizations and community power that we're trying to build.
Thank you, Surina, and some really helpful practical examples there again from you in terms of implementing and thinking through intersecting inequalities for some of the organisations that are participating today. I'm going to come on to our final question, and I'm hoping to come to each of you. So if you don't mind keeping it relatively brief, then we'll be able to get you all to answer this final question, which is about the future. So what we'd like to ask you is what feminist leaders really need to focus on now going forward if we're going to continue to make progress despite the challenges that we're facing. We're going to ask for input from attendees, participants. So for those of you listening, if you've got ideas about this, we would really like to hear them in the chat box. So what aspects of feminist leadership, or what's resonated with you today that you'll take forward in your own work? If you want to pop that in the chat box, then we'll come to it at the end as well. Jean, can I come to you first on this?
Yeah, I think it is time for us to think about, when we are talking about the new normal, how do we come to that new normal at a better point? This is an opportunity for us. COVID has laid bare, has painted a vivid picture of the unjust structure of our world, the oppressive systems that we are living in that allow just a few to thrive at the expense of many. And so it's time for us to think about what exactly is the new normal. We can't speak about the new normal, but what exactly is it, and what are the practical issues we are putting out? What are the practical learnings? What are the practical alternatives, practical feminist realities that we are putting out, as opposed to all the theory that is easier to put out than the practice? So I think it's time for us to focus on an intersectional, politicized analysis of social justice work based on a feminist, principles, for everything, the whole world order. If I had my way, the entire world would be, living on feminist principles. But it's time. Why not? Why shouldn't we think about that? What would a new world look like? What would a new just world look like? And what is our role in promoting that? Not just in talking about the theory and analysis, but the practice as well. Because this is why we have siloed issues like what we've just been talking about, where I feel like my fight is different from so-and-so's fight, yet we are dealing with the same oppressive intersecting systems of power.
Great, thanks, Jean. Lee, can I come to you?
Yeah. So I just wanted to bring back in the previous discussion on Black Lives Matter, because I think that has fundamental implications for where we are as a sector. And I've been really thinking as well lately about, it's 3 years ago now, but like really courageous women speaking out about sexual abuse and harassment in the very sector that many of us work in. And although that was shocking and deeply, it hurt us as women in our sector, but not many women I knew were really surprised by it. And I think it's the same now with the anti-racism movement. And I think it's quite literally a day of reckoning for the sector. And I think the impact of COVID and this resetting of how we work actually means that we have a real opportunity to think about and to present a vision of how we as people working on women and girls' rights and of course women and girls themselves want the world to be. So I think it's a day of reckoning. I think we need to go back to the original human rights frameworks, because I think now many leaders and decision makers want new bits of paper, new accords, new commitments, and actually the Beijing Platform for Action is still a really progressive, holistic set of standards for women and girls' rights. And there's a really important opportunity that should have been this year, 2020, has been delayed to next year, to really get countries to recommit to some of those rights. And I think, as we've seen from the brilliant women's rights organisations represented in this call, that we need to put women in the lead, and we need to ensure that women's rights organisations across the world, and particularly in the global south, have the funding, long-term flexible core funding that they need to do their work, to present their visions, to hold their governments and the international community to account. And I say that really advisedly, because I don't work in a women's rights organisation anymore. I work in a large INGO, and I think we need to think as the international community and the INGO community where we need to step in and step up, and then very much where we need to step back and let women's rights organisations lead.
Here, thanks, Lee. Viv's nodding. Viv, can I come to you?
Thank you so much. Absolutely, Lee. I agree. I think international NGOs do need to give their money to local women's rights organisations and support them to do the work. I think there is an element of neo-colonialism in the way that the international NGO sector works. Obviously, some more than others, but I think that is problematic. And if you talk about decolonisation, that has to be part of that discussion. I think we have a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity with the shifts that are occurring and with the debates that are happening and even what's on the TV, to actually really shift the analysis of what a healthy, successful society, country, world looks like, based upon, as Lee said, a human rights framework that is politically driven around social change and human rights. and that has to be social, environmental, and economic. The question is, how can we achieve that? That's the question. Well, one of the questions that I'm besieged by all the time, because research shows that the biggest changes in women's rights occur when there is independent, collective, women-only action. And so that's what I want to see, is how do we, so I just talk about here in the UK, how do we as a sector work better together? Because the environment that we work in pushes us towards competing for money. But, you know, as women, we've always had to be creative in situations that are not built to meet our needs or not built to allow us to have our freedom. And I think we've got to get back to thinking creatively. I think we've got to have more dialogue. I think we've got to have consciousness raising. I think we've got to listen to each other. We've got to think about the different needs of women and centre the poorest and the most oppressed women in what we're doing. But I do think there's an opportunity, if we can recognise it for what it is and actually use the collective power that we have, which is considerable, to actually work across our differences and on our shared end goal.
Absolutely, really powerful message. Thanks, Viv. And then finally, Surina, can I ask you the same question to end with?
Yeah, I just will really agree with all that's been said. And I think just to, put a point on it, I guess, is that we really need to be thinking from abundance, lead with courage, in integrity and honesty, and to really, the question that I've been asking myself and our team is, of what we're doing now, what do we want to take into the future? Because this is an opportunity to reset, restructure. It's not about recovery. It's not about going back to, the normal that we had was not good. If anything, this pandemic has shown a light on all that was wrong. And so we have an opportunity to really restructure, redesign, reimagine. And in order to do that, I think we really have to think from abundance and think about what we want to carry into the future. And so I saw a little bit on the chat about, the 4-day work week. That's something that I can tell you our entire team has said we want to keep that. And so that can be a new normal. And I can just anecdotally also just share that, we have actually been more productive. We've gotten out probably 180 grants in this 3-month period, more than we've ever done in a 12-month period. And so I think that we're coming up with new creative ways of being. And I think we should hold on to the parts of those that are working and allow it to sort of nourish us and feed our souls so that we can really imagine and walk into the future that we want to see for this world.
Thanks, Surina. Wow, I'm a bit blown away by the inspiring comments and leadership that you four are sharing. Thank you so much for sharing your insights. Layla, is there anything you want to draw on from the chat box? I can see there's loads of comments coming through, so I'm sorry we won't be able to represent them all.
Yeah, loads of comments. I think some of the things people are taking away, the notion around collective power, particularly starting from the community level. So, enough of this top-down decision making, we're thinking more bottom up. Self-care, the need to centre that much more. Discussing feminist leadership principles at every level of the organisation. People loved Viv's idea around a web of leadership and the points about accountability, how to centre accountability in your leadership practice. I just want to say as well, there's some great ideas for future discussions that we could hold, the role of men in all of this. How do we get funders on board with some of this agenda? As well as, what do we need to do as feminist leaders to cultivate young women's feminist leadership more broadly? So, yeah, Natalie, back over to you. We can't see you, Natalie. You've got a bit blurry.
Oh, sorry.
There you are.
I've covered myself up. There you go. I'm back. Thanks, Layla. Yeah, we would love to be able to continue the discussion and come to all the questions and comments, but we just are about to run out of time. So there's plenty of food for thought there to think about for future discussions. We're going to start closing the session today. As I've mentioned in the chat box at the beginning, lots of you were asking if we're going to be sharing the recording, and we will do. There'll be a follow-up email to this session that will have that in there, as well as some other information. So we just wanted to end the discussion really by acknowledging all of those feminists whose work on feminist leadership has been really foundational to this discussion and to Layla and mine's learning journey as well. It's essential in particular that we highlight the work of feminists from India, especially writings by Srilatha Bhatliwala. We can also look at the work of feminist human rights organisations like Kriya in India and Akina Mama Wa Africa in Uganda. In the UK, we would really encourage you to check out the work of the Women's Resource Centre, who Viv is representing here today, who are doing some really excellent work, really excellent work to spread the word about what feminist leadership looks like and how especially it differs from other leadership models. So for those wanting to find out more about that, I'd really encourage you to visit their website to find out more about the courses that they offer. Layla and I also do work on feminist leadership, and we have developed some trainings and courses where we take a strong focus on supporting people to analyse how intersecting structural inequalities show up in our workplaces, to support them to think about how we can act collectively to dismantle those. We also write pieces about the subject, and we convene small action learning groups for people wanting to learn about how to apply feminist leadership in their own contexts and organisations. So please do get in touch with us if you think we can help you do that. There'll be a slide at the end of the session, which I'm hoping Layla might put up in a moment, with our contact details, as well as the websites and contact details of our panellists. You'll get that information in the follow-up email as well, where you can also opt to receive our newsletter or sign up to our mailing list. For those based in Francophone West Africa, thank you so much for joining. I really hope the interpretation has worked okay for you. Check out in particular the work of OSIWA, who are supporting this agenda in the region. And if you're based in the region and are working on this issue, we'd love to hear from you, so please do get in touch. There will be a little pop-up when you leave the session today, asking you for some feedback. So we would be hugely grateful if you could share your thoughts about that, because it will help us think about perhaps bringing this group back together again, or continuing to answer some of the questions that you had today. And finally, thank you so much to our amazing, inspiring panellists for joining us today, for sharing their expertise and insights, and for giving up their time to join us. We really, really appreciate it. And we thank you all, those who have attended today, for signing up and joining in the discussion, providing such rich comments and questions in the chat box. I've really enjoyed seeing them, and we hope you've enjoyed this as much as we have. Layla, is there anything else you'd like to add to end?
No, just to apologise for the slides. Natalie, you've disabled my slide sharing.
Sorry.
Sometimes I think technology kind of pushes us to feel like we have to be perfect, and none of us are perfect, which is why my slide sharing isn't working. But that's okay. I've just typed all our contact details in the chat box, so we'll go with that, and we'll share it in the follow-up link.
I think I can do it right now. So here you go. If you're still with us, here it is. And we'll stay live for a few seconds before we close the session. But thank you again for everyone for attending.
Oh, and thanks to Merrill. Thanks to Merrill.
Thank you to Merrill.
Thank you, Merrill.
Really appreciate it, Merrill. Okay, thanks everyone.
Thank you.
We stopped broadcasting now.